So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Singh, and I'll be presenting something today that is maybe a little unexpected here at the GSD. But my presentation today is called Beyond the Center, Improving Home-Based Childcare in Low-Income Communities. Our agenda today, first I'll give a brief introduction to the topic and my research questions. Then I'm going to situate home-based childcare in the field of community development. Third, I'll talk a little bit about how community developers are involved with the delivery of early care and education. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about methods and conclude. All right, so there's some kids in Rhode Island. And thought it was cute. But liven up the 2 o'clock presentation. I'm sure y'all are falling asleep. So early child care and education, or early care and education, is actually shown to be one of the most effective means of reducing the achievement gap and contributing to long-lasting, equitable neighborhood revitalization. Early care focuses on children aged 0 to 5, and it takes 3 primary forms, the most common of which is center-based care, or preschool. The focus here today is going to be home-based care, which I'll explain in more detail in a moment. At the same time, early care access and quality are 2 primary challenges for people who come from low-income backgrounds. However, community developers are well positioned to use their strengths to improve early care delivery for these groups. The specifics on how community developers should engage with early care and education, both the system and the providers, are still being developed, and this research is part of that development. So for my thesis, I asked 4 questions. The first is going to be, how do community developers plan for the delivery of these kinds of services in their communities? The second is, how do community developers engage with the existing home-based child care system in order to improve stability of service offerings and child developmental outcomes? The third is, how do these organizations work with the providers in order to achieve the same goals, so stability and improvement in outcomes? And then finally, what lessons can practitioners and policymakers draw from these experiences in order to deliver better quality educational opportunities through the existing private market-driven system? So home-based care as community development. So early care and education is not really talked about much around here, but it is actually part of community development. Community developers, as I'm defining here, are community-based organizations that focus on community revitalization, and those ones who carry out this work. Historically, such organizations have focused on housing and real estate. However, recent research presents compelling evidence that housing is necessary but ultimately insufficient to reduce poverty. Indeed, the conditions of poverty actually, some of this research has shown, poisons the brains of the developing minds of these young children, which ultimately contributes to the achievement gap and fuels the cycle of poverty. The combination of quality housing and quality early care and education has been shown to be a fantastic combination to actually be an antidote to this poison. So community developers are making investments in these areas. However, there's little guidance for doing so, even though community developers have been involved since 1989, and we see that the National Center for Children in Poverty at Columbia actually found in 2002 that CDCs are incredibly well positioned to do this kind of work. So before I proceed and talk a little bit about the early care system to give some context, the system here is unlike our public education system in that it's private and it's market driven. We see that the public system targets groups, populations, based on certain characteristics for funding. There's not universal funding or programming. And then finally, the public system, when it targets low-income populations, primarily emphasizes parental employment. It doesn't really emphasize child development. This is especially problematic when the achievement gap is the only thing talked about in education these days. And we see that services, when they're delivered, there's typically a distinction made between infants and toddlers who are age 0 to 2 and preschool-age children age 0 to 5. The types of early care and education I talked about briefly earlier are center-based care, which is preschools, typically for ages 3 to 5. Home-based care, which I'll be talking about more in depth in a second, ranges from 0 to 5 and can actually go older. And then home visitation focus kind depending on the program, will target one group or the other. So home-based care, there are two general types. The first type is family child care. Now, these kinds of arrangements are formal, they're regulated by the state, and they're essentially child care businesses run out of people's own homes. The second kind is kith and kin care, which some may know as family, friend, and neighbor care, which is more of an informal arrangement, may or may not be paid, and usually under the radar from regulation. And there's not a whole lot known about these types of providers, but ultimately what has been found is that the care environments are warm and nurturing. However, there are limited educational activities within these types of environments. Despite this lack of educational opportunities, home-based childcare actually holds tremendous promise to improve developmental outcomes for low-income children, or children in low-income areas. Estimates from a nationally representative sample actually find that 70% of the paid childcare workforce in the U.S. is home-based care providers, which is completely phenomenal given, when I think of childcare, I think of preschool most of the time, and I think that's probably common for a lot of people in the audience here. Home-based providers, by drawing on them, we're actually drawing on existing community assets, so we don't have to go about and create 50 million different centers, whether it's Head Start or another kind of subsidized program. And so it's ultimately potentially less expensive, and we can, instead of looking at things from a deficit perspective, we can build on what's already there. So how do community developers fit into the picture ultimately? This summer, I did some research, which I'm drawing off of for this project, and I did what's called a SWOT analysis to test this perspective, or question rather. For those of you not familiar with this, it is a strategic planning tool that organizations typically use to test the feasibility of a stated objective. Here I'm using it within the context of testing the objective for a given field. Now, what it stands for is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses are internal, the others are external, and I'll be focusing mainly on the internal factors. What I found is that, so while community developers, as I stated earlier, they have been and continue to be critical players in early care and education. The roles, however, tend to be at the systems level, and this is primarily due to their strengths and their weaknesses. We find that strengths include a stable community presence, community connections and partnerships, leadership building capacity, and data gathering and analysis. However, they're housing organizations, so their expertise in early care and education is going to be limited. Some examples of groups that have done this kind of work, and this is specifically focusing on home-based childcare. One is NeighborWorks Blackstone River Valley, which is where I got the picture of the kids in the beginning. And they have since had to cease this part of their operations because of state regulations. It's kind of complicated things. But what they had done previously is they'd actually created special apartment units in scattered site housing that are a little bit more durable, and they're specially designed with children in mind, so that families can move in and they can run these businesses and have the proper facilities to do so. Additionally, they partnered with a local partner and LISC, a national housing intermediary, to deliver training and technical assistance to these businesses. Another group is Housing Partnership, which is located south in Florida, and they have community centers through which they carry out place-based development work. And they've reached out to family care providers, and they've established ongoing relationships with these centers. Finally, I'll discuss a bit of my methodology and conclude. So I anticipate using case studies with semi-structured interviews. I anticipate this may also change depending on what I find in terms of being able to just find the organizations to do this work, or that do this work rather. But I'm going to be starting my search, and I have a few groups in mind already, with a nationwide scope right now, just because it is so rare. And I'll be targeting them based on their involvement with the early care and education policy system more generally, and then secondly, based on the type of home-based care providers with whom they engage. And there's a whole typology which I won't go into the details here, but it's fairly complicated. So, so just to conclude, some key points to reiterate. First is that high-quality early care and education has been shown to reduce the achievement gap and poverty. Second is that community developers are well positioned to lead these improvements in the early care and education system. And then finally, home-based childcare holds tremendous potential to efficiently reduce poverty over time. Thank you, and I'd like to take your questions.
Thanks, Patrick. Would anybody like to start? Joyce, please.
I thought you described it really clearly, and this very laudable goal. I thought there was a missing context.
Missing context, okay.
That is, how does ECE compare to Head Start and the good alternatives to ECE?
Okay, so probably could explain that a little bit better. Head Start is a form of early care and education. Early care and education encompasses a whole swath of programs.
Right, but it sounds like you're opting to have planners really investigate ECE home-based care. So why should planners do that if Head Start is a better alternative in terms of educational outcomes? See, what I'm saying in context is, should we promote that, or should we be promoting Head Start, or are there benefits to, comparable to a parent at home? Are there alternative forms of home-based ECE or ECE that may be even better than home-based ECE that you're spotlighting there? So to me, that was a missing context, because I want to be persuaded that, oh, this is a really worthwhile topic for planners to really investigate and dig into. Maybe Head Start offers such an outstanding benefit of that. So I think you need to just compare them and make your case, make your argument for this type of approach, the home-based ECE approach. I think without that, I'm not convinced that that's the way to go. That maybe we should be advocating further towards.
So okay, so I guess if I were to talk a little bit about cost. Because basically, because one of the prime considerations I would say is that the systems are already in place, and it's just a matter of augmenting them. And second, Head Start, when you look at per child cost, is they provide an enormous amount of services, and I'm not saying to replace Head Start, because ultimately an early care and education strategy has to have multiple tiers, multiple layers of whatever you're doing. But it's almost $10,000 per child per year to operate one of these kinds of places, whereas if you're looking at early care and education, it's potentially a lot less, when you're looking at home-based care, it's potentially a lot less expensive because you just take out the facilities equation.
And that's notwithstanding the fact that 70% of the employment in early care is home-based.
Yeah.
So that's a staggering statistic. When you say on the one, exactly. So it's completely labor-intensive, and yet much cheaper. So it's a better quality product for much less. So just to echo that point, I want to, that statistic really jumped off the slide for me. It was like 70%, and labor presumably is the highest cost, but apparently not. There's all kinds of other costs that are driving it. Clearly what it's piggybacking off of, sorry to jump the...
No, please.
Is the fact that it's in the home. So the infrastructure is already built. You're just sort of piggybacking off of the existing infrastructure. And so that way, I think it's a massive cost advantage.
And it seems like there's a tangential argument that you might want to drive home with those two about the kinds of communities where the infrastructure required for not at-home care happens. And this seems particularly advantageous, what you're proposing in certain types of communities, maybe where that kind of physical infrastructure isn't likely to happen, and which is probably precisely the type of places where community developers are at work. So, Diane,
I was sort of under the impression, though, that one of the reasons why this is such a low-cost form of childcare is because the providers are extremely low-paid. And that's also related to the quality issue and the funding issue. So while I think that idea of home-based care is really great in a lot of ways. Kindergarten was originally non-institutional, and there are a lot of arguments about it having been better than. I think there are bigger issues here, like parents' ability to pay, parents' work schedule, government investment in these things, just a whole poverty generally. Obviously, it's poverty alleviation, but we know that a lot of these things are vicious cycles. I don't quite know. I guess that was my biggest question. Is like, okay, do you really improve the quality just by having a developer provide a space and some kind of training? Or like, do we really need to be investing in like new education programs for early childhood teachers? Do we need to be providing subsidies to poor parents so that they can pay their child care providers better, so that they can hire better people? It just seems like there's that the human capital issue on the front end is a really big challenge here that that maybe the community development corporations can help with. Maybe they can build relationships with local colleges. Maybe there are neighborhood resources that can be drawn from, but that's not really part of what you're talking about yet. And I think that would really strengthen the argument.
Okay, so looking into the consequences for the providers.
Well, yeah, I mean, why is it that it's so low quality right now? And that should point you towards other kinds of solutions, and beyond sort of the kind of organization providing the solutions, I guess is my point.
Well, I think one of the challenges with early care and education in the U.S. in general is that research has found that as a whole it's actually just a crap system. Like, to be perfectly honest.
Exactly.
Like, I mean, there's when you look at quality on average, it's low in all 50 states. It doesn't. I mean, basically, the people who can pay the most get quality education, but other than that.
Or they have a parent stay home, right? And that goes back to Joyce's question, like what is the best practice, or what do education specialists say provide the best outcomes, and what are the tools to get you there? And then you say, okay, we know we have leverage at this institutional level. How can we situate ourselves into this broader framework? But if you don't have the broader framework, then I'm left concerned that you're still going to have, low English competency, poor women providing the service to other poor women and their children, and perpetuating the cycle even if they have a nice play area to play in.
Okay.
Well, Matthew, I think the presentation, I agree with Joyce, that is very clear. However, though, I have a sense I don't truly understand why. To me, I feel that you actually are afraid to really go into it and deal with the problem and trying to understand the system. Even though it's a good presentation, but it's really on the surface, okay? Even though the title is Beyond the Center, and you are proposing maybe CDC can play some kind of role in this, and in your examples, there isn't, study, understanding what kind of role the CDC can play here. And the two case studies, what's their organization? What can they provide? What they cannot provide? And what's the pros and cons? Okay, that I think we want to see it through the specific example. And also, as a planner here, because it's a design school dealing with physicality, maybe some kind of perspective regarding the location of these care and the people who provide these care, what's their education level, what's the good thing about having this kind of system or benefit. So there isn't this kind of very concrete analysis. I think the SWOT analysis is not in depth. I think that SWOT analysis as a tool is very basic. I think there needs to be another, even the cost benefit analysis that needs to be here, because SWOT analysis is a kind of consulting just on the surface. Okay, this is strength. It's very obvious. Okay, as academic work, you need to go one step further. So somehow I think you have very clear structure, but to me, I feel that you don't have the courage to go really into it, because you can figure out this system and then provide your ideas beyond the center. I look at your conclusion. Your conclusions are not really tied into your analysis, or your analysis is not really supporting what you try to say.
He's sort of proposing the methodology he will pursue, of course.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not final by any means. I guess.
Yes. Or maybe, I think that's the direction, probably,
Okay.
I think, for final.
Okay.
And I think you have very clear structure. That's very good. But try to put all the pieces together and really go into it, trying to think, okay, this is the developers, this is the organization, why these organizations, in your view, can play this, as a dominant player here, right?
So I think Bing's comment is helpful in the way that because you, of course, are proposing a methodology here, and nailing down what you want to know will be really important in determining what kind of methodology you pursue, right? Are you going to look at how many CDCs? Are you looking at sort of what they could do, or are you looking at what they do? Are you going to, sorry, sorry, yeah, but you know what I'm saying, right? Do you really want to understand what they have done? Are you going to map across
No, it's going to be more specific. It's,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be more specific than that.
Like digging into 2 or 3, and then really understanding how they make it work. Is that?
Yeah. I think that's the idea, because there's some of the work I did this summer was a little bit more broad-based, and so I'm trying to delve more deeply.
I think
So
that's a good, good direction. Look at specific examples. Look at their organizational structure. Look at what the financial resource and human resource and all that make them appropriate for this role or not.
Okay.
I think that would be very helpful. And also, some analysis of the physical characteristics that they can do with the community, right? They are, after all, developers. So maybe critique that a little bit also would be helpful. Yeah.
So let's go to, why don't you actually both take Belinda and Sam, and then you can respond to all of the comments together.
Just a very short comment. I understand that so far you have a very clear idea of your research, but I would really like to see what's going to be your proposal, and how much real is it going to be? Like, are you going to come to some conclusions and that's it, or you're going to come to some conclusions and some actions to get those conclusions kind of implemented? I don't know. I mean, I could talk and talk, but I know we're running out of time, so.
Let's go to Sam first.
Chris,
Yeah, just similarly, I think what's the key organizing question of your work? So what is the question you're actually trying to get an answer to? Because I think it's going to be a much smaller part of what you laid out. And I do think in the end, quality is the ultimate question, right? What is the outcome of this? And I would look at, both in terms of dollars and in terms of intensity of activity, a whole range from whatever's considered the absolute top of early childcare or early childhood education down to whatever else is, and then figure out where some of this discussion fits in that, because I think not all early child care is equal, and that's part of what's happening.
And look at what the criteria are and assess them.
This is very helpful in that sometimes especially at the proposal stage, it's helpful when multiple reviewers give you kind of very similar, almost identical feedback. And this issue of quality, you're making a claim that this is something that should be pursued, but people want to hear this sort of subsidiary claim, not sort of how you would pursue it, but that this is worth pursuing, that there is some sort of intrinsic value to this way of dealing with early childhood education that would then merit your later claims, and this is how you then deliver on it, right? So people just want to know right up front that this is a credible way of delivering quality education. Almost a subsidiary claim before you get to your claim of, and here's how you could actually do it. Go ahead.
So proving that you can deliver quality education through home-based means?
Or that home-based is the best strategy for delivering quality.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the bar is a little bit lower, but that is a good approach that has some sort of benefits. And what might those benefits be? You started to touch on that, but I think you get the sense from multiple reviewers that they want a little bit more there.
But there must be a literature in education that speaks about the quality of these things. You should present that.
So I guess what I'm hearing to try to put all this together, because I feel like
Please.
a lot of
Yeah.
different things, is that it would be very helpful to compare home-based care to other forms of early parent education to give more of a context and to make the case that this is a route that we should be pursuing.
Does that sound? I'm seeing a lot of nods.
Yeah.
Okay. Joyce, do you want to?
Really short. I had to question your basic definition of home-based ECE. Can we compare grandma and grandpa babysitting with paid providers, in a home? I don't know. I mean, maybe. But I think of grandma and grandpa as, babysitting, just being with their grandchild. But that's in your definition, family and the paid providers. So
yeah,
I don't
so
know.
the reason I included that is that sometimes you'll have most typically if a person's going to be paid, they'll be a friend or neighbor. So typically you might have someone who's doing that in the community, and then it might take on 1 or 2 more children, and then they'll be like, oh, I actually like doing this, so maybe I should look into getting licensed or something like that. And it's that kind of transition. So it doesn't,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main reason why that is included.
Okay.
Matthew, thanks a lot.
Thank
And
you.
as always, it's nice when you get that multiple sort of confirmatory feedback
Yes,
from different
yes,
peers.
it is.
So, way to go.
All right, thank you.